You might want to retake that. Your scar just broke the lens." That's what the teen behind him hymned loud enough for the whole mall to hear. People laughed. The old man didn't flinch. He just adjusted his collar, looked straight into the photo booth camera, and waited for the flash. 1 second, one white burst, and when the picture printed, everyone stopped laughing. Because behind him, perfectly centered, stood a soldier in uniform, hand raised in a silent salute. If you believe some scars deserve more than silence, comment respect below. Arthur Lane had grown accustomed to the stares. At 74, the retired Marine had carried the scar on his right cheek for far longer than he'd lived without it. The jagged line that ran from his temple to his jawline had been with him since 1969, a permanent souvenir from a rescue mission outside Da Nang that had earned him a Purple Heart and sent 3 of his brothers home in flag-draped coffins. In the decades since, he'd watched the reactions change. First came the uncomfortable glances of the 70s when any visible reminder of Vietnam made civilians shift in their seats. Then the cautious questions of the 80s and 90s as the country slowly reconciled with its veterans. Now, in a world obsessed with cosmetic perfection, the scar had become something different, an anomaly in an airbrushed reality. Arthur rarely spoke of his service. His weathered green cap with the Marine Corps insignia said enough for those who knew how to read such things. He lived quietly in Millfield, a small town where most locals had learned to look past the scar to the gentleman who volunteered at the library and left anonymous gifts for struggling families at Christmas. This particular morning, Arthur had a simple errand. His veteran transit pass needed renewal, which required a new ID photo. Rather than wait at the crowded VA office, he'd opted for the mall's photo booth. Quick, private, and good enough for a simple ID. The Westbrook Mall was busier than usual for a Thursday. Summer vacation had released packs of teenagers who roamed with the restless energy of the newly unshackled. Arthur navigated through them with the patient precision that characterized his movements, making his way toward the photo booth near the food court. He joined the short line standing behind a young mother with a toddler who was having his first photo booth experience. The child's delight at seeing his own image appear on the small screen brought a slight smile to Arthur's weathered face. As the mother and child finished, 3 teenage boys joined the line behind Arthur. They carried the swagger of young men who believed volume equated to importance, their conversation deliberately loud enough to serve as performance for anyone nearby. One of them, a tall boy with carefully styled hair, nudged his friend and made no effort to lower his voice. "Hey, look, it's Two-Face," his friend snickered. "That his camera needs a trauma setting." The third boy, slightly shorter than the others, glanced at Arthur's profile and added, "Major special effects alert." Their laughter rippled outward, catching the attention of food court patrons who turned to see the source of amusement. Some quickly looked away in embarrassment. Others, finding safety and distance, allowed themselves small smiles at the cruel jokes. Arthur didn't react, didn't turn, didn't speak. Such comments had long ago lost their power to wound him. His expression remained neutral as he stepped into the booth, inserted a crumpled $5 bill into the machine, and sat on the small stool, adjusting his posture to fit the frame. Behind him, the laughter continued, following him into what should have been a moment of privacy. "Dude, I bet the camera's gonna crack," the tall boy continued, leaning against the side of the photo booth. Military-grade scar versus civilian equipment. His friends erupted in fresh laughter as they crowded near the booth's entrance, deliberately positioning themselves to watch Arthur's discomfort. The mall atmosphere amplified their mockery voices, bouncing off polished floors and glass storefronts. "This is too good," said the second teen, pulling out his smartphone. "I'm recording the scarred old dude getting glam shots. It'll blow up on TikTok." Inside the booth, Arthur sat with military straightness despite his years. He adjusted his collar, making sure the edge of his shirt covered the beginning of another scar that ran down his neck and across his collarbone, a companion to the facial one, earned in the same explosion that had taken his friends. His eyes, gray as gunmetal, looked directly into the lens without emotion. The digital display counted down 3, 2. The flash burst white against the booth's blue curtain background, momentarily illuminating Arthur's face in stark relief, the scar catching the light like a river seen from above. He remained seated for an extra moment, as if allowing something unseen to settle. Then, with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that rushing rarely improved matters, he stood and stepped out of the booth, reaching for the printed photo that had slid into the external tray. Let me see that monster mug. The tall boy snatched the photo before Arthur could grasp it, his face already arranged in anticipation of new mockery. Then his expression changed, froze. The smirk vanished, replaced by something between confusion and alarm. "What the hell?" he whispered. The other two boys crowded around, their laughter dying as they stared at the small rectangular print. A hush fell over their previously boisterous circle. The photo showed Arthur sitting straight-backed and solemn, just as he had posed, but behind him, where there should have been only the blue curtain of the booth, stood a figure that had no business being there. A soldier in full dress uniform, his features slightly blurred, as if caught in motion, yet his posture crystal clear. His right hand was raised in a formal military salute, executed with textbook precision. Though the booth was barely large enough for Arthur alone, the soldier stood perfectly centered behind him, as if the physical constraints of the space simply didn't apply. The teens looked around wildly, searching the food court for any sign of the uniformed man who must have somehow slipped into the booth. But the nearest service member was an Air Force recruiter at a table 50 yards away, deeply engaged in conversation with a prospective enlistee. That's impossible," the second boy said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Nobody went in there with him. The third boy, who had been filming, frantically checked his phone. "I got the whole thing. There was nobody." He stopped staring at his screen with growing unease. "The video's corrupted. It's just static." Arthur reached forward and gently but firmly reclaimed the photo from the tall boy's now unresisting fingers. He studied it for a long moment, his expression softening, almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, but recognition. "Sir," the tall boy began, his earlier arrogance evaporated. "How did—" "Some men don't laugh at scars," Arthur interrupted quietly, his voice carrying the faint rasp of age and perhaps something more. They saluted that. He carefully placed the photo in his inner jacket pocket, turned and walked away. His gait was unhurried, dignified, bearing no sign that anything unusual had occurred. Behind him, the teen stood frozen still, staring at the empty booth as if expecting further revelation. Within minutes, the strange photo began its journey beyond the mall's walls. The third teen, though unable to save his video, had managed to snap a picture of the photo itself before Arthur reclaimed it. He posted it to his social media with a shaking hand emoji and the caption, "No filter, no edit." Nobody was in that booth with him. What the hell? By evening, the image had been shared thousands of times. Commenters debated its authenticity, offered technical explanations, suggested paranormal theories, but veterans who saw it responded differently, with a quiet recognition that required no explanation, no debate. One former Marine wrote simply, "Some bonds don't break when the heart stops beating. Semper Fi, brother. If you believe the flash sometimes reveals more than the eye." Comment, respect below. By the following morning, the photo had transcended ordinary virality. It wasn't just trending, it had touched something deeper in the national consciousness. Major news outlets picked up the story, initially treating it as an interesting curiosity. Mall photo booth captures mysterious figure, but quickly shifting tone, as the image resonated particularly strongly with military communities. Captured respect. The salute behind the scar became the prevailing caption, as the photo spread across veteran forums, military family groups, and eventually traditional media. Comments numbered in the hundreds of thousands, many from veterans, sharing their own experiences of unexplainable moments of connection with fallen comrades. Local news vans parked outside the Westbrook Mall, reporters interviewing shoppers who had been present during the incident. Witnesses offered consistent accounts. No uniformed soldier had been seen entering or exiting the photo booth. Arthur had gone in alone and emerged alone. The soldier in the photo had appeared only in the developed image, visible to no one until that moment. "I was standing right there," said Maria Gonzalez, a barista from the coffee shop opposite the photo booth. "That old gentleman was by himself. Nobody else went in. I'm certain of it." Mall security, initially resistant to media requests, eventually released a brief statement along with a short clip from their surveillance system. The grainy footage showed Arthur entering the booth alone. No one followed him in. When he exited, no one else emerged. Yet there in the photo, unmistakable despite the slight blur, stood the saluting soldier. A retired military photography analyst named James Harrington contacted the local news station after seeing the broadcast. Using digital enhancement techniques developed during his service, he examined the photo and identified details invisible to casual observers. The uniform insignia belongs to the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Harrington explained during a segment that aired nationally. That unit saw heavy combat in Vietnam, particularly during the period of 1968 to 1970. The style of the dress blues and certain details of the ribbon placement suggest this image represents a Marine from that exact era. When reporters learned that Arthur Lane had served with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines during precisely that period, the story took on new dimensions. Attempts to secure an interview with Arthur were politely but firmly declined. He had returned to his quiet routine, seemingly uninterested in his sudden fame. Then 4 days after the incident, a plain white envelope arrived at Arthur's modest home. No return address, no postmark, as if it had been hand-delivered directly to his mailbox. Inside was a high-quality print of the same photo and a single line of handwritten text on heavy cardstock. "We still watch your 6." The handwriting was immediately familiar to Arthur, distinctive, with sharp angles and heavy pressure on the downstrokes. It belonged to Lieutenant Michael Delaney, who had died in Arthur's arms during the same explosion that had given him his scars. The man who had pushed Arthur down at the last second, taking the worst of the blast himself. That evening, a hesitant knock sounded at Arthur's door. When he opened it, he found the 3 teenagers from the mall standing on his porch, heads bowed and shoulders hunched. No phones were visible, no swagger remained in their posture. "Sir," the tall boy began, his voice catching slightly, "we came to apologize. What we did it was wrong. We're sorry, we didn't know," added the second boy, "about your service, about what that scar really meant." Arthur studied them for a moment, noting the genuine remorse in their expressions. Then without a word he stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. His living room was simply furnished but immaculate, with the precision of a man who had never lost his military habits. On the side table, newly displayed, sat a shadow box containing medals he had kept in a drawer for decades. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the Vietnam Service Medal. Beside them stood the photo, now framed in simple black wood. "Sir," the third boy asked hesitantly, "do you know who that is in the picture?" Arthur's weathered hand moved to touch the glass briefly, a gesture of such gentle reverence that the teens fell silent, somehow understanding they were witnessing something deeply personal. "He knew us," Arthur said finally, not directly answering the question. "When I got this," he gestured to his scar. Others ran from the incoming fire. He ran toward me, a pause heavy with half a century of carried memory. "Some debts can't be repaid, some bonds can't be broken." The teens stood in respectful silence, suddenly aware that they were in the presence of something they could not yet fully comprehend, but instinctively recognized as worthy of their reverence. Over the following weeks, Arthur's life resumed his quiet rhythm. He continued volunteering at the library on Tuesdays, nodding politely to the increased number of patrons who now recognized him. He still took his morning walks through Millfield Park, though now he occasionally received respectful nods from strangers who had seen his story on the news. The photo, however, had taken on a life of its own. The management of Westbrook Mall, recognizing both the publicity value and the unexpected depth of public response, installed a small brass plaque beside the photo booth in honor of the unseen salute, June 12. No further explanation was offered. None seemed necessary. What began as a spontaneous gesture from a few local veterans evolved into an unspoken tradition. Every Wednesday at noon, veterans from surrounding communities would arrive at the mall. They formed no lines, made no speeches. Each simply stood behind the photo booth for exactly 30 seconds, the time it had taken for Arthur's photo to develop. Standing at attention, saluting, mall security, initially concerned about the gathering, quickly understood its significance and ensured the area remained accessible. Ordinary shoppers would stop, fall silent, and often place hands over hearts as the veterans performed their quiet ritual. On social media, thousands changed their profile pictures to the mysterious photo. Military units from across the country sent challenge coins to Arthur's symbols of respect, normally exchanged only between service members. He arranged them carefully on a special shelf, each one representing a silent conversation between those who understood service and sacrifice. The 3 teenagers who had mocked Arthur's scar became unexpected ambassadors. They spoke at their high school about respect, about looking beyond appearances, about the invisible weight of history carried by ordinary people passing through everyday places like shopping malls. 1 year after the photo was taken on a perfect June day, Arthur returned to the mall for the first time since the incident. A small ceremony had been organized, nothing elaborate, just a simple gathering to mark the anniversary. No speeches were scheduled, none were needed. A single Marine Corps bugler played the haunting notes of taps,
the melody floating through the usually bustling food court, now hushed in reverence. A line formed spontaneously, civilians and soldiers, young and old, each pausing to salute a framed copy of the photo that had been mounted on the wall opposite the booth. Arthur watched from a distance, standing near the same entrance he had used a year before. His posture remained military straight, despite his advancing years. His face, scar and all, remained composed in dignified silence. But this time something was different. This time he smiled, a slight curve of lips that had seen both battlefield horror and profound brotherhood. A smile not for the attention or the ceremony, but for something or someone visible, perhaps only to him. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories if you believe the flash of respect always finds those who stood for it.